It is my pleasure to introduce another authority and leading voice in the global stage on issues pertaining to the future of work. So I'd like to introduce to our participants Dr. Ian Goldin, who is a professor of globalization and development at the University of Oxford and the director of the Oxford Martin Program on Technological and Economic Change. From 2003 to 2006, Professor Goldin was vice president of the World Bank, and prior to that, he was the bank's director of development policy. From 1996 to 2001, he was chief executive and managing director of the Development Bank of South Africa. He also served as an advisor to President Nelson Mandela. His most recent book, Terra Incognita, 100 Maps to Survive the Next 100 Years, was just published in October 2020. Thanks so much for being here, Ian. It's really a pleasure to have you.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. So, Ian, you're the author of many books. I just mentioned Terra Incognita, but you've also written a book that I really enjoyed reading, among many others, The Age of Discovery, Navigating the Risks and Rewards of Our New Renaissance, that you co-authored with Chris Katarna, published in 2016. And to me, that book almost seems prescient now. I want to start by reading a passage from that book for our participants, and then I will come back to you to kind of break down sort of how you've seen some of what you said back then play out today. So the passage is as follows. The present age is a contest between the good and bad consequences of global entanglement and human development, between forces of inclusion and exclusion, between flourishing genius and flourishing risks. Whether we each flourish or flounder, and whether the 21st century goes down in history books as one of humanity's best or worst, depends on what we all do to promote the possibilities and dampen the dangers that this contest brings. And I read those words, and when I remember reading the book a few years ago, and then I went back to it recently as I was writing an article, because really those words, as I said, are almost prescient. So what do you see as the most profound fundamental economic impacts of the pandemic? If we were to go back to February, let's say you and I were talking in February, could you have foreseen this economic moment that we are in right now? And what are the most fundamental and profound impacts of the pandemic? And how long and deep do you think this crisis will be?
Well, thanks, Sabina, for reading my books and remembering them, which is a real pleasure for an author to know that people take these things seriously and retain them. I think, just with your first question, could we have foreseen this? Yes. The surprise to me is not that there's been a pandemic or that it's led to global economic disaster, mass suffering and poverty. That we knew was likely to happen. I predicted it in Age of Discovery. In the book I did previously, The Butterfly Defect, Why Globalization Creates Systemic Risks. And every year for the last 10 years, not just me, many people have seen the global pandemic as inevitable, and that it would inevitably lead to a global economic crisis. So why don't we do anything about it? Why don't we stop it, is the question really we should be asking. And will this be the last pandemic? Will this be the pandemic to end all pandemics, like the Second World War was the war to end all world wars? And that's absolutely possible, and that's my hope, that it is a wake-up call, that we currently spend globally maybe 20,000 times more money on military than we do on pandemic management, when anyone that knows the relative risks associated with these two different things will tell you that a pandemic is many thousands of times more likely to kill us, or to ruin our lives and livelihoods. So we need to get our proportions right. And of course, that requires actions on the ground for pandemic management, but also reinforcing organizations like the World Health Organization, which should be the NATO, a global fighting force to stop pandemics, and absolutely could be. So the first thing is globalization brings good things, including this ability to communicate with each other, to learn things around the world, to have vaccines, and many, many other wonderful things. But it brings bad things, cascading financial crises, cyber attacks, pandemics, climate change, and other disasters. And we cannot carry on in this way. It's totally unsustainable, because those bad things will get worse. And so this has to be a wake-up call. In terms of your second question of how bad is this and how long will it last, I think in terms of the deadliness of the pandemic, it's actually not nearly as deadly as the Spanish flu or previous pandemics could have been, but we're much more contagious because we have many more people and much more connection, and we are more interdependent. The impact on different economies is totally different. I mean, we've seen China, South Korea, Taiwan already exit the pandemic effectively. Their economies have recovered. China will have probably 5-6% growth rate this year. India, the US, Brazil, devastating. UK, France, similarly so. And the real tragedy, as you're experiencing in India, is in countries where there's no safety net. Here in the UK, no one's going to die of starvation as a result of this pandemic. If they do, it's a huge failure of the system. There are massive food banks and other infrastructure. But in India, many people will die. And that's not from the pandemic. Yes, many people die from the pandemic, but more people will die of hunger and starvation. And then there's all the mental health implications, which are so hidden: suicides, depression, which is a global phenomenon. So my view is that this is likely to end in the advanced economies within the next 6 months, because they'll have vaccines, because they'll escape, and there'll be a rapid bounce back. But in poor countries, including India, it's going to be a 2 or 3 year longer slog, and for Africa, much worse. And that's because it's going to be much more difficult to get vaccines into the system in sufficient quantities. So it's going to, what the pandemic's done in all countries, in rich countries and in poor countries, is widen inequalities dramatically. In rich countries, there's a safety net which protects people, but 125 million more people around the world have been forced into extreme poverty, at least. And so it's the most devastating crisis the world has seen since the Second World War by far. And it totally derails the Sustainable Development Goals and others. That's why we mustn't bounce back. That's why, my nightmare is the idea that we go back to normal, because that normal that got us to where we are. That normal means we will inevitably have more pandemics in the future. We inevitably will have escalating climate change. We inevitably will have growing inequality. That's not the world I want to live in. And I'm sure none of the people participating in this webinar want to live in that world. So we have to change our ways globally and nationally if we to, at least out of this terrible suffering, come out stronger.
No, thank you, Ian. I think that these remarks as opening remarks are really valuable, because they touch upon so many of the issues that I'd like to delve a little bit deeper with you through this conversation. Because as you rightly just pointed out, it's one thing to consider the impact of pandemics or of climate change, but it's another thing to consider the fact that our institutions have not kept up with the pace of change, that we've constructed a global economic system that is not conducive to taking care of people in the face of such challenges. And so I'd like to come back to that. But what I think is, but before we come to that, when I was talking to Manish, as you caught some of it, I was throwing a bunch of true or false questions at him. I wanted to mix up the format a little bit. So one of the things I said to him was, this moment in which we're seeing the confluence of different forces, we're seeing advancements in technology, we're seeing climate change, rapid urbanization, which I think you've called, the urban epoch, that are upending the way that people live and work. I asked him, true or false, this moment is a decisive moment in human history as opposed to just another cyclical downturn. Now, how would you, based on what you just said, I have a sense of what you might say, but what would you say, true or false?
Absolutely. We're at crossroads in human history, and the decisions we take this year, coming few years, will set the pattern of humanity for the next 100 years. Because if we learn to cooperate and manage ourselves as a planet, within nations, between nations, stop global threats, then we're on a path of a more inclusive, shared prosperity globally, where we manage climate change, we stop pandemics, etc. Mm-hmm. If we don't, if this leads to growing inequality, growing populism, growing conflict between countries, less ability to manage, we're really in a downward spiral. And it's a nightmare world of escalating inequality, climate change, etc., etc. Mm-hmm. So the choices we face now, I really do believe, and I know it's the vanity of every generation to say this time is different, it's a very special time, the decisions we make. The difference between this time and previous times is that it's truly global now. So what India does or what the UK does, the US does, will impact people around the world. The Second World War was terrible and people felt that was a decisive moment in human history. But actually it was really mainly about Europe and a few other countries, Japan, etc. It wasn't really about India at that point. Obviously, there was decolonization afterwards. So this is global, and what the pandemic has shown us is that every one of the 7 billion people on Earth are touched by it, and that's new. It's the first time we've had a global event that affects everyone on Earth simultaneously, and that's historic, and it's part of this new realization of how entangled we all are, our lives, wherever we are in the world. And the pandemic can come from anywhere. Climate change is going to affect people everywhere. That's the new world. So we need to change our ways. And I think it is an absolutely decisive time. It's a crossroads.
So what's interesting, Ian, is that Manish actually answered that question by saying false. Right?
Oh, really? I didn't hear that part.
He did. That was the first thing I answered, and he said false. Now, of course, he's not here to explain why, but I imagine the reason that he said that he thought that was false was because with the acceptance that we are in this unprecedented moment, also comes a certain degree of fear that we don't have the institutions and the systems in place to be able to deal with the current challenges that we're confronting. And so I think his saying false was also in some ways a shrouded message of hope, in the sense that no, we can still do stuff. We can still change this paradigm. But what I'm also interested in is what you just said, which was, this is the first time ever that everyone around the globe is affected. When we take that global perspective, I absolutely see what you're saying. But what if we flip that perspective around and looked at it from a national or even local perspective? Does someone in India, or someone in a district in India or in South Africa or any global South country, do they feel like this is an unprecedented moment, or is it just one of the challenges that they're, one of many challenges that they're confronting? and not just the pandemic itself, but also additional transformations, right? Like the awareness of climate change as the existential threat of our time. Is that just something that you and I that look at the world from a global perspective see, or is it also, do you think, from in your view, is it also something that is woven into the perspectives of real people on the ground at local and national levels as well?
Yeah, I would have liked, maybe you can organize a discussion between Manish and I for the future, because I'd love to engage with it. But we're very privileged to be able to see, to be connected, to see things globally, to be involved in lots of conversations, and to be able to gain global perspectives, which people who are in their daily grind of work in the countryside, on a small holding, or a hawker on a street, or anything, might not have. Although we should never underestimate people's capacity to understand what's going on, and their information flows with all the information that we have. Often fake information flows, like the anti-vaccination one, for example. It's a contestation of ideas that takes place from the highest level to people on the streets who are getting fed all the information through different media. Or in the countryside, or religious groups, or others that are feeding different perspectives on what's happening. But I think people experience change in their own lives. If you go into the countryside, as I've done in South Africa and other countries, not in India, people will tell you that the climate is changing, that the weather patterns are changing, that crops they used to plant at this season, now they have to plant a month later, or they're not getting the rain, or the yields are down. They experiencing the joblessness, the inequality. They're seeing the size of the richest people's cars and homes and things. They are not immune to these global trends. They're just experiencing them from the ground up, and they're recognizing that there's great change. They can't, and you see in India now the protests going on, which I just pick up in small ways. People sense the change and interpret it in their own lives. I think they, poor people have always had very tough lives, and in some respects things are improving. Life expectancy numbers tend to be going up, not this year, but in previous years. Schooling is improving, rights are improving, there is progress. And that's why I think one needs to be optimistic, and that's why I believe in globalization, because a lot of it has come from international flows of ideas. And science and technologies, but it's a struggle, and and at the point we are at the moment in 2020, it's one step forward and two steps backwards, and unless we are able to leap ahead and get into a different frame, people will be more and more affected. Mumbai is going to be underwater because of climate change. Dhaka in Bangladesh, with the millions of people that live there, underwater. People's lives will be fundamentally changed, and but it happens slowly, and then suddenly you lose your livelihood and you die if you are unfortunate not to have the options. Rich people have options. They'll just move to higher ground, turn on the air conditioning, pump water from deeper and further. They can immune themselves to many of these things, but it's the poor people that are at real front line of these global changes. And that's why, although they might not see them in the same ways that we do, they're much more affected than we are. And that's why anyone that I believe that believes in solidarity and believes in poverty reduction and a more inclusive world needs to fight very, very hard for it, because all of these changes can go to vastly improve people's lives, to reduce hunger. The Sustainable Development Goals said eliminate poverty and hunger by 2030. That's in 10 years' time. That's not going to happen unless something very radical changes.
And so on this point of unless something very radical changes, Karl Polanyi, the famous economic historian, argued that the economy has to serve society rather than society serving the economy, right? Have we built economic systems that force trade-offs between economic performance and human well-being? Are we at this juncture where we need a different economic paradigm that's centered on human welfare. And what would that actually look like? Does the current moment present an opportunity to shift trajectories in favor of this new paradigm that is centered on human welfare as opposed to the singular focus on economic progress?
Yes. There are lots of different strands of economics, and there are lots of economists who believe that. So I wouldn't sort of put economics against yes or no. Economics, like any subject, is a toolkit, and it's vastly expanding. It's the question of what you use the tools for, and what your purpose is. Economics can be used and has been used and is used in many countries and many places to create much more inclusive, much more shared economies. There's a whole group of economists who are working out how to transition from fossil fuels to zero carbon to stop climate change. But we absolutely need to reprioritize to make sure that our economies serve the interests of ordinary people. That's a political contestation because rich people are capturing politics. In the US, the most recent presidential election cost $10 billion. You need $10 million to be a congressperson. The idea that it's a system which allows anyone to flourish is a complete fantasy. This requires tough choices, including very high taxes on wealthy people, including inheritance taxes and wealth taxes. They're not going to like it. People don't like rich people generally don't like the idea of taxes. So it becomes political very quickly. Now, my own view, and I'm being very encouraged by many people that are saying this, including wealthy people, is that's the only way for all of us to survive.
Yeah.
So it's out of self-interest, in the same way that it's out of the self-interest, I believe, of rich countries to make sure that poor countries are successful and do well. It's out of the interests of rich people to also ensure that they have inclusive, sustainable societies. Then you get into the detail. But yes, absolutely, we need to reprioritize our societies, and we need to ensure that at the center of it is the well-being of every individual in the society, physical and mental.
And what I think is very interesting is what you pointed out as sort of the political realities that sometimes preclude the realization of economic models that put human welfare first. And it's also easy to kind of kick the can down the road sometimes and say, climate change is happening, and it definitely it's the biggest existential threat for all of us, rich or poor. But maybe we can diffuse the responsibility and both kick the can down the road and expect someone else to take care of it. One of the issues that I've been looking at in that context is this idea of jobs, and how does not the impact of climate change on jobs, which is of course very real, as you just mentioned, Ian, but also the extent to which the transition from dirty fuels to more clean sources of energy would entail actually transitioning in some economies thousands of people, not just in those sectors, but also sectors downstream from them, and what the costs of that might be. And so that's an example. For example, we take the coal sector in India, and we think, okay, we're going to easily transition those people that are working in the coal sector into clean energy sectors. It's not going to happen, right? There's a lot of costs until there's place-based specificities, there's the skills training realities and educational reality, the backgrounds of a lot of these workers, there's health related issues. So the transition is not an easy one to make, and the just transition isn't just about the impact of climate change, saying, okay, we need to address that otherwise, but it's also about how do we mold an economic reality where the benefits of something like that are politically salient enough to get our decision makers to actually do something about it, right? So Ian, with that, I think 10,000 question, or whatever the phrase is, $1 million question. And I would like you to respond to that and leave us with sort of your ideas for, the top things that need to happen, the 3 things that need to happen in order to mold global governance such that we are actually reconfiguring our economic paradigm in a way that puts human welfare first. So that's small question in the last 3 minutes, Ian.
2 minutes, yeah. Thanks, Sabina, and thanks for having me. And it's been great. The 30 minutes has really flown by. I think, as you've highlighted with this question of the just transition on energy, when the reason, and you see this dramatically in the Midwest of the US, where people who've lost their manufacturing jobs supported President Trump, like the people in the north of England supported Brexit, and crazy ideas which are not in their interests, which will destroy the economy in the same way that Trump has destroyed many things in the US. But people basically are worried about their jobs and their incomes. And we need to be able to respond to that when we say to people, we want to close down the coal mines, we want to close down the power stations. It's good for the country, and it is, and it's good for the world. You have to give people an opportunity, and it's often in a different place, and they don't want to move. They're lived, and their families and their lives have been where they are. You have to give them vouchers, you have to give them an ability to move, and you have to give them a guarantee that if they lose their jobs, they will not starve. So you have to pay them basically pensions, even if they're 40, for the rest of their lives, because it's in the national interest. Society wants them to do something they don't want to do, and they have to be supported in that. How's it going to be paid for? The rich countries are going to have to pay much more. They account for the majority of the stock of carbon in the atmosphere. For 100 years, Britain was the biggest carbon emitter in the world after the Industrial Revolution. Now it's only 5%. China's double the US, but historically, the US is well over 3 times the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So the rich countries are going to have to pay their historical obligations. And that is part of the carbon transition. But India and other countries also need to contribute, and we're going to have to pay more for energy in the transition. In the long term, the price of energy will go down. So we have to look after those that are losing their jobs, but their concern about their jobs cannot stop us doing the carbon transition. Because to say to them, okay, we're not going to let you in your job to produce coal for the rest of your lives, is going to be to wreck India and the world. So that's not an option. My final 1 minute on priorities and what this all means. My hope is the pandemic is a huge wake-up call, that we don't reset and go back to the operating system we had when it's over, that it's given us a time for reflection. It's taught us what's important in our lives, the value of friendships, of family, of solidarity, of young for old who are making massive sacrifices. And that out of that, we are prepared to give more. There's been a rush of volunteerism, which is incredible. People putting their lives at stake in hospitals around the world and in other areas to support those in need. That needs to be translated into action at the global level. The fact that aid is going down this year because the income of the rich countries is going down is a scandal. The fact that the rich countries have found $12 trillion for themselves in packages to support their workers and things, and less than 1% for poor countries. The vaccine nationalism. These are the things that we need to rebel against, we need to protest against, and we need to create a more inclusive and sustainable world. If we don't engage in this battle of ideas, and it is a battle of what's right, then one is giving over the space. And inertia of the system will mean we just carry on as we were before. So it's a time for action, for reflection, and we have every possibility for creating a better world. But it won't happen on its own. It'll happen because good people make it happen. And my hope is that your conversations are part of that process. So thank you for inviting me to join you, and good luck to you and to all the participants.